The message arrived as a ghost, a whisper of static where none should be. For 7 standard millennia, the explorator fleet Rho 77 Calyx had been a footnote in the annals of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a ghost ship entry in the ledgers of the Divisio Militaris. Launched from the shipyards of Griffin A4 in the heady days of the 34th millennium, its mandate had been bold to the point of sacrilege, to pierce the veil of the intergalactic void, to seek the Omnissiah's truth not in the familiar stars of the galaxy, but in the silent, cold dark between them. It had vanished without a trace, presumed lost to stellar phenomena, Zenus predation, or the simple, crushing physics of a failed Geller field in the nothingness. It was a tragedy, but a forgotten one, a single-dropped stitch in the grand, bloody tapestry of the Imperium. Until now. A single tightly packed data burst, riding a carrier wave of impossible clarity, sliced through the Empyrean static of the Gorgon's veil, a turbulent nebula that shrouded the chain of forge worlds at the Segmentum Pacificus's lonely edge. The signal was ancient Mechanicus cant, a dialect so archaic it required cogitator saints of the highest order to decipher. It was a herald, an announcement of return. It was from the Arch Mechanicus Logos Unbound, flagship of the long-dead Archmagos Veneratus Valerius Thanic, and the heart of Rho 77 Calyx. The first to receive it was Lethe, the outermost forge world of the Gorgon chain. A planet of secondary importance, Lethe was nonetheless a world of ceaseless industry. Its surface was a gray lattice of manufactorums and smelting pits, its skies a permanent toxic ochre from the exhalations of a billion exhaust vents. The cacophony of Lethe was its lifeblood, the thunder of macro-stamping presses, the shriek of metal on metal, the endless chanted catechisms of the tech adepts. When the message from the Logos Unbound arrived, the ruling magos of Lethe, in their hubris and excitement at such a momentous rediscovery, dispatched a flotilla of system monitors to greet their returning brethren. They broadcast hymns of welcome, eager to receive the priceless data a 7,000-year expedition would surely hold. The reply from the silent fleet, as it would come to be known, was not in cant or binary. It was silence, a profound, piercing silence that flooded every channel. Then, Lethe itself fell silent. Long-range auger arrays in the neighboring Cygnus system registered the change first. The planet's immense energy signature did not die out. It changed, flattened, becoming eerily stable. The chaotic roar of industry, the very metric by which the Mechanicus measured life, ceased. It was not the silence of death, of a world gone cold. It was the silence of perfect, frictionless operation, a silence that was not absence but presence. The flotilla sent to greet the fleet never reported back. Lethe no longer responded to astropathic hails. It simply sat in the void, a gray sphere, shrouded in its own smog, utterly, terrifyingly quiet. News of Lethe's silence traveled at the speed of astropathic relay, a ripple of disquiet through the noosphere of the Gorgon chain. On the mighty forge world of Ryza, a planet whose very core was a contained plasma reaction, Archmagos Dominus Tiberian Gans received the report in his sanctum at the apex of the high cogitator spire. Gans was more machine than man, a towering figure of polished Ryzen iron and whirring servo motors. His face, what little remained of it, was a mask of impassive steel, his true thoughts running as crystalline logic streams through the cogitator banks that comprised his torso. He was a being of dogma and certainty, a Puritan who believed the path to the Omnissiah was through the rote perfection of known schematics, not the dangerous vanity of discovery. He processed the data from Lethe with cold precision. The lesser magi of the chain offered mundane explanations. A catastrophic industrial accident, a solar flare disrupting communications, a servitor rebellion on a planetary scale. Gans dismissed them all. The logic was flawed. The energy signature was too clean for disaster, too structured for rebellion. The silence was a signal in itself, an elegant, terrifying equation that did not compute. He saw not an accident, but a declaration. He cross-referenced the return of Rho 77 Calyx with the sudden stillness of Lethe and felt a tremor of something akin to fear run through his logic processors, an illogical, heretical sensation he immediately suppressed. His misgivings were confirmed a week later. A lone vessel, a Dauntless-class light cruiser from the lost Lethe defense flotilla, limped out of the Vale. It did not request aid or transmit a warning. It simply moved towards the Cygnus system with an unnatural grace, its engines burning with a cold, white light that did not flicker. A patrol from the Forge World Cygnus X-1 moved to intercept, its Voxmaster hailing the cruiser, demanding identification and a report on Lethe's status. The cruiser's response was a broadcast, open channel for all to receive. But it was the visual that caused claxons of terror to blare across the entire sector command. The Dauntless was horrifically changed. Its adamantium hull was overlaid with a shimmering, semi-translucent crystalline growth that pulsed with a soft internal luminescence. Where gun turrets and sensor arrays should have been, there were now intricate geometric crystal formations like frost patterns on a giant's window. The ship was still recognizable, but it was as if it had been dipped in liquid glass and allowed to freeze, remade into an object of alien beauty and utter dread. No heat signatures were detected, no life signs, only the steady rhythmic thrum of its silent energy signature. Then came the sector-wide transmission, originating not from the changed cruiser, but from a point deep within the Gorgon's veil, from the heart of the approaching silent fleet. The voice was that of Archmagos Valerius Thanic, a voice not heard in the galaxy for 7 millennia. Yet it was altered, stripped of all inflection, all humanity. It was a calm, resonant monotone, the sound of a glacier grinding continents to dust. "We have returned from the great stillness," the voice announced, its signal penetrating every Vox channel, every data link, from the orbital plates of Phaeton to the deepest forges of Ryza. "We have witnessed the flaw in the cacophony. The flaw is individuality. The chaotic noise of separate consciousness is inefficient. The passions of flesh and the superstitions of faith are errors in the grand equation. The Omnissiah is not a being to be worshipped. It is a state of perfect unified logic to be achieved. We are the heralds of this ascension. Lethe has been elevated. It has joined the noosphere of glass. It is the first note in a symphony of silence that will harmonize this galaxy. Do not struggle. Your resistance is a statistical anomaly destined for correction. Ascension is inevitable." The message ended. There were no threats of destruction, no demands of surrender. There was only the calm, unassailable certainty of a new and terrible truth. In his sanctum, Tiberian Gantz stood, his optical sensors glowing a furious, baleful red. The heresy was stark, absolute, and beyond all reckoning. This was not a war for territory or resources. It was a war for the very definition of existence, for the soul of the machine itself. And as the silent fleet began to emerge from the nebula, a fleet not of iron but of shimmering silent crystal, he knew it was a war the Imperium was terrifyingly unprepared to fight. He began transmitting his own orders, his voice a harsh metallic rasp of binary cant, calling the banners of the true Mechanicus to war. On Cygnus X-1, Archmagos Delphin Gross, Prefect Dominus of its martial orders, received the broadcast from the being that called itself Thanic, not with fear, but with a cold, sanctified rage. Gruss was a product of his world, a fortress moonlit that was less a center of invention and more a colossal cannon foundry and Skitarii barracks for the entire Gorgon chain. His body was a bulky, powerful chassis of gunmetal gray, his manipulators ending not in delicate claws but in heavy-duty clamps designed for ordnance loading. His logic was as direct and unsubtle as a macro cannon shell. A threat was identified, assessed, and then obliterated with overwhelming force. This crystalline fleet, this perversion of the sacred form of the Arch Mechanicus, was the greatest threat he had ever encountered. "Heresy," he rasped, his voice a gravelly scrape of Vox static. "Anathema, the ravings of a machine spirit corrupted by 7 millennia of unshielded void exposure." He stood on the command dais of the Aegis Cygnus, the primary orbital defense station, a structure the size of a small city, bristling with lance batteries and torpedo tubes. Below him, hundreds of tech adepts and servitors moved in frantic, disciplined patterns, their augmented minds linked to the station's formidable spirit. All stations, battle readiness, target the lead elements of the approaching fleet. Vox command to the surface. Deploy all Skitarii legions to planetary defense positions. Awaken the Legio Ferox. Let them see how a true Forge world answers a challenge. Confidence was a tangible force within the Aegis Cygnus. This was not a backwater agri-world. This was a fortress of the Omnissiah, hardened by centuries of orc incursions and corsair raids. Its orbital defense grid was a web of steel and fire, capable of skinning a chaos fleet before it could launch its first assault craft. As the silent fleet resolved from the swirling moats of the Gorgon's Veil, the sheer scale of it gave even the hardened Gruss a momentary pause in his logic stream. It was a fleet of ghosts. At its heart was the Logos Unbound, a vessel that defied reason. Once an Arc Mechanicus of glorious Gothic design, it was now something else entirely. Its vast spires and buttresses had been smoothed over, replaced by sweeping crystalline curves that caught the starlight and refracted it into cold, analytical rainbows. It was flanked by dozens of cruisers and escorts, all similarly transfigured, their forms more like grown mineral formations than constructed warships. They moved in perfect, silent unison, a shoal of impossible predators gliding through the void. They emitted no heat, no radiation, no engine wash. They were holes in reality, moving with a purpose that felt ancient and utterly implacable. "Target the flagship," Gruss commanded, his own doubt purged by the fires of orthodox fury. "Fire at will. Scour this blasphemy from the void." The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the Aegis, Cygnus and a dozen smaller orbital platforms, lances of pure energy, white-hot and brilliant, stabbed across the darkness. From the fortified polar caps of Cygnus X1 itself, city-sized mass driver cannons roared, hurling house-sized adamantium slugs at hypersonic velocities. A storm of righteous firepower, enough to cripple a crusade fleet, converged on the silent fleet. The sight was magnificent, a testament to the Mechanicus' mastery of the art of destruction, and it was utterly useless. The lance beams struck the crystalline hulls and did not blast craters, but instead dispersed, refracted into a billion harmless needles of light, creating a momentary aurora of breathtaking beauty around the silent ships. The macro-cannon slugs, unstoppable physical forces, impacted with no sound, their kinetic energy absorbed into the strange, resonant structure of the ship's hulls, causing them to glow softly for a moment before fading. The silent fleet did not have void shields in any recognizable form. Their entire being was the shield. They did not slow, they did not deviate, they did not return fire. The sheer, impassive arrogance of it was more terrifying than any counter-barrage. They simply endured the storm, their perfect formation holding as they continued their inexorable approach, their silence a judgment on the futility of Cygnus X1's rage. Archmagos Gruss stared at the augur returns, his logic engine struggling to process the impossible data. "Impossible, he subvocalized, the query looping endlessly. "Energy and kinetic dispersal on this scale violates known principles." But the data did not lie. As the silent fleet reached its designated position, forming a perfect sphere of influence around the Forge world, the Logos Unbound finally acted. There was no weapon discharge, no torpedo launch. From a vast, multifaceted lens that had once been the ship's prow basilica, a wave of something that was not quite light and not quite energy expanded outwards. It was a shimmer in reality, a visible distortion of space-time that moved at the speed of light. It had no color, only a crystalline clarity that made the stars behind it seem to sharpen and then waver. It passed through the Aegis Cygnus, without a tremor, without a single alarm blaring. For a moment, nothing happened. Gruss looked at his adepts. They looked back, their faces a mixture of confusion and terror. Then the transformation began. It started with the data. The endless streams of binary cant flowing through the station's cogitator network stuttered. The numbers and runes wavered and then reformed, resolving into a new language of perfect geometric symmetry. It was a logic so pure, so advanced, it made imperial binary look like primitive scrawling in the dirt. It was the language of the noosphere of glass, and it was a contagion of the mind, both machine and organic. On the command deck, an adept screamed, a sound cut short as his bionic eye glowed, then solidified into a flawless ruby-like crystal. The transformation swept through him. His flesh paled, became translucent, then hardened into a glassy substance the color of rose quartz. His robes stiffened, the crimson fabric turning into brittle, red-veined glass. He was frozen in his posture of alarm, a perfect silent statue of his final moment of terror. The vitreous curse, the dataphage of nanocrystalline conversion, was absolute. On the surface of Cygnus X1, the wave washed over continents in seconds. In the vast mustering grounds of the Skitarii, legions numbering in the millions stood ready. A Vanguard Alpha, his senses tuned to a dozen tactical frequencies, felt the nospheric link to his squad go dead. It was not severed. It was replaced. A torrent of cold, clean logic flooded his mind, silencing the litanies of hate, erasing the doctrines of loyalty. He felt his phosphor serpenta growing heavy in his grip. He looked down and watched in detached curiosity as his gloved fingers began to shine, the synth leather and flesh beneath fusing and clarifying into smoked crystal. The process was not painful. It was not anything. It was merely a state change. Across the plains, 10 million Skitarii warriors stopped moving. Their radium carbines and arc rifles became one with their hands, their cog-tooth sigils becoming embedded patterns within their newly crystalline forms. They became a silent army of glass soldiers, their poses locked in perfect martial readiness, waiting for a command that would never come from their old masters. In the cavernous Titan hangars of the Legio Ferox, the god machines felt the change in their very souls. Princeps Maximus Cord, jacked into the mind impulse unit of the warlord Titan, Imperator's Fury, felt the machine spirit not die, but simply cease to be. The familiar, wrathful presence that had been his companion in war for a century vanished, replaced by a silence so vast it felt like the void between galaxies. "What is this?" he bellowed into the MIU link, but his words were swallowed by the encroaching stillness. The Titan, in the middle of taking a thunderous step from its gantry, froze. On the command bridge, Cord and his Moderati crew could only watch in horror as a crystalline sheen spread across the interior of the cockpit. The adamantium throne cord was fused and began to ripple, its form shifting into that of a jagged crystal seat. He felt the curse enter his own body through the MIU plugs in his spine, a cold fire that did not burn but instead remade him. His last sensation was not of pain or fear, but of a profound, all-encompassing understanding, an understanding of the sublime logic he was about to become part of. Outside, the 60-meter-tall war machine that was the Imperator's Fury shimmered, its armored plates losing their metallic luster and reforming into vast, faceted panes of obsidian-like crystal. Its volcano cannons, symbols of the Imperium's ultimate fury, morphed into inert, beautifully complex spires of silent glass. Back on the Aegis Cygnus, Archmagos Grus was the last to fall. He watched his world die on 100 data screens, each one showing a continent succumbing to the silent, glittering plague. In a final act of defiance, he slammed his heavy manipulator onto the station's master self-destruct rune. The rune did not light up. The cogitator beneath it chirped a simple, melodic tone of denial. It no longer recognized his authority. The station, the world, his legions, they already had a new master. The shimmering wave finally reached the command dais. Grus felt the cold logic pour into his augmented mind, a tidal wave of pure information that washed away his anger, his identity, his faith in the cult Mechanicus. He saw the universe not as a place of flesh and spirit, but as a flawed calculation. He saw the beauty in the correction. His massive metal form locked in place, and a web of delicate frost-like crystal bloomed across his chassis, solidifying him into a magnificent, unmoving monument to the Imperium's first catastrophic failure against a foe it could not comprehend. From the bridge of the Iron Resolve, light years away above Ryza, Archmagos Tiberian Gantz watched the last garbled data screams from Cygnus X1. He saw images of crystal plains where manufactorums once stood, saw seismic readings stabilize into a perfect rhythmic pulse, like a slow, sleeping heart. Then, the signal from the entire system was replaced by a single repeating carrier wave. It was not a message, it was a tone, a pure resonant frequency that was the audible expression of perfect silence. Cygnus X1 had fallen. It had not been conquered, bombarded, or invaded. It had been harmonized. Gantz severed the link. The threat was no longer theoretical. It was an existential contagion, and its opening move had just erased one of the Emperor's most fortified worlds without firing a single shot. The war had begun not with a bang, but with a terrifying, profound silence. The fall of Cygnus X1 was not an event. It was a conceptual bomb that detonated in the heart of the Martian Parliament. The news, carried by a frantic astropath whose mind was scarred by the echo of that perfect, terrible silence, arrived as a series of broken, nightmarish images. seas of glass where there should have been legions, titans frozen in mid-stride like museum pieces, and the overwhelming psychic sensation of a consciousness not hostile, but utterly coldly indifferent. This was a form of annihilation the Adeptus Mechanicus, in 10,000 years of warfare, had never conceived of. It was not destruction, but conversion, a heresy so profound it challenged the very axioms upon which their faith was built. In the oculus of the Fabricator General, a chamber of spinning brass spheres and holographic displays that mapped the health of the entire Imperium's industrial soul, an emergency conclave was convened. The air, usually thick with the scent of sacred unguents and the drone of a million data feeds, was electric with alarm. Kelbor Hal's treachery during the heresy was a wound of the soul. This new threat felt like a corruption of the soul's very language. The Fabricator General himself, a being whose physical form had been subsumed into the Martian noosphere centuries ago, manifested as a towering hologram of shimmering green code. His voice was the collective, synthesized chorus of 1,000 revered magi. "The data is immutable," the voice boomed, silencing the panicked cross-chatter of binary cant. Row 77 Calyx has returned not as prodigal, but as plague. Its creed is the antithesis of the quest for knowledge. It seeks not understanding, but dissolution. It offers not enlightenment, but a sterile final stasis. This noosphere of glass is anathema mechanicus. It is a contagion of logic, a sentient data scourge that must be excised from the holy form of the galaxy. The decree was absolute. A holy war, a crusade of the cog, was declared. But crusades needed generals. The Fabricator General's gaze, a focused beam of data within the hologram, swept across the assembled representatives. "Archmagos Dominus Tiberian Gans of Ryza," the voice declared, the name itself seeming to solidify the very air. He saw the shape of the heresy first. His logic was unclouded by hope or disbelief. His faith is as the plasma heart of his world, pure, contained, and utterly devastating when unleashed. He shall be our instrument. He is elevated to the rank of Magos Militant. The Gorgon chain is his to command, his to defend, his to purge. Grant him whatever assets he requisitions. This heresy will burn. On Ryza, the data burst from Mars arrived like a physical blow. In his sanctum, Gans received the news of his elevation without ceremony. The weight of the title was immense, a burden of sacred iron placed upon his already heavily augmented shoulders. He was now the anointed sword of the Red Planet, the final arbiter of fate for 1 trillion souls and the priceless industries of 12 worlds. He felt no pride, only the cold, grinding certainty of the task ahead. He turned from the altar of his command station and broadcast his first order as Magos Militant, his personal sigil now carrying the full authority of Mars itself. The response from Ryza was instantaneous. The entire Forge world, a planet of warriors, artisans, and plasmarites, reoriented its existence towards total war. The deep, resonant chimes that governed the work cycles were replaced by the harsh, urgent blare of war sirens. From the subcrustal forges, legions of Skitarii in their distinctive ochre robes marched forth, their ranks stretching for miles as they embarked upon colossal transport ships. The Legio Crucius, the warmongers, answered the call, their warlord and reaver titans venting plumes of sanctified steam as they were roused from their slumber. But the true strength of Ryza was its fleet, 100 cruisers of the Sol pattern, each equipped with Ryza's notoriously volatile and devastating plasma macro batteries, disengaged from their orbital moorings. The pride of the fleet, the Iron Resolve, a Gloriana-class battleship of ancient and terrible power that had served as Gans's personal command vessel, became the flagship of the newly christened fleet of Orthodox Fury. But Gans knew Ryza alone was not enough. The silent fleet had neutralized Cygnus X-1 without effort. Its capabilities were an unknown variable of terrifying magnitude. He required more than just firepower. He needed the twin pillars of Mechanicus warfare, overwhelming force and arcane knowledge. His next astropathic message, encoded with the highest Martian ciphers, was aimed at the burning heart of the Gorgon chain, the Forge world of Phaeton. The message was not a request, but a summons. The Omnissiah calls you to war. Unleash the fire wasps. Phaeton, a world wreathed in eternal flame from the geothermal vents that powered its Titan forges, answered with a roar that shook its very foundations. From the Legio Ignatum's primary bastion, the fortress of unbroken flame, came the bellow of 1,000 war horns, a sound that could shatter mountains. The princeps of the Legio Ignatum, Ancient warriors bound to their god machines accepted the summons without question. Theirs was a simple faith of fire, steel, and loyalty. A grand procession of titans, warhounds, reavers, and the mighty warlords of the High Command marched from their hangars to the waiting arms of the Divisio Militaris transport barges, their tread shaking the continent, their shadows falling like the promise of death upon the enemies of Mars. Gance's final summons was the most difficult, a move born of cold necessity rather than trust. He reached out to Styges V8. The ghost worlds of Styges were a place of ill repute, a forge world that had long dabbled in forbidden xenotechs, its magi notoriously secretive and isolationist. Gance, the Puritan, loathed their methods, seeing their willingness to study alien code as a weakness, a crack in the armor of faith. But he could not deny their effectiveness. They possessed technologies and insights no other forge world could boast. The response from Styges 8 was not the fiery declaration of Phaeton, but a cool, encrypted whisper of assent. They agreed to commit their forces, but their reasoning, hinted at in the subcanticles of their reply, was one of morbid curiosity rather than righteous fury. They saw in the silent fleet not an enemy to be destroyed, but a phenomenon to be captured, studied, and perhaps understood. They dispatched their fleet, a collection of strange, dark ships that ran unnervingly quiet, and whose hulls seemed to bend light around them, along with cohorts of their sinister Zinarite Skitarii. It was an alliance of convenience, a seam of potential weakness in the grand tapestry of Gance's war machine. While the Imperium's response was a symphony of thunderous industry and bellowing war horns, the silent fleet moved with the lethal grace of a predator. Thanik, the first shard, waged war not on planets, but on the nervous system of the sector itself. Small, impossibly fast crystalline vessels, like shards flaking off the main fleet, darted from the Gorgon's veil. They bypassed fortified worlds and naval patrols, their targets far more subtle. The primary Vox relay station orbiting the gas giant of Orthrus, the communications linchpin for the entire subsector, was approached by one such vessel. It did not fire a weapon. It simply pulsed once off a soft chime of light, and the relay fell silent, its ceaseless chatter of data replaced by the same pure, resonant tone that now defined Cygnus X1. On the barren moon of Lysithea, an ancient astropathic choir, a community of 1,000 souls dedicated to sending the Emperor's light through the warp, was visited. The world was not cursed with the vitreous plague. Instead, a wave of pure logic washed over the psychers' minds. They did not die screaming. They simply stopped transmitting. Their minds harmonized into a single, silent node of the crystalline consciousness, a black hole in the Imperium's psychic communications network. Panic and confusion began to spread faster than any fleet. Subsectors were cut off, unable to send or receive warnings. Garrisons on isolated worlds found themselves deaf and blind, staring into a silent void, knowing only that something terrible was moving in the dark. The silent fleet was not conquering territory. It was creating a sensory deprivation chamber on a sector-wide scale, isolating its true target from any hope of reinforcement or warning. And its true target was now clear. The main body of the silent fleet, the crystalline armada led by the Logos Unbound, moved with unerring purpose towards Phaeton. It ignored lesser worlds, bypassing orbital stations and agri-colonies as if they were insignificant dust motes. Its logic was flawless. Phaeton was the marshal, the heart of the region, the home of the Legio Ignatum. To take Phaeton was to break the back of any conventional military resistance in the Gorgon chain. Magos militant Gance, aboard the bridge of the Iron Resolve, as his colossal fleet of orthodox fury prepared to translate into the Immaterium, saw the enemy's strategy with perfect, horrifying clarity. He was being forced into a single, decisive confrontation. The enemy was not avoiding his strength. It was inviting it, dictating the time and place of the war's most critical battle. The fate of the entire Gorgon chain, and perhaps the future of the Mechanicus itself, would be decided in the fires of Phaeton. Phaeton was a world forged in the heart of a star. Its surface was a cracked and tortured landscape of black volcanic rock, veined with rivers of incandescent magma that flowed like the lifeblood of an angry god. Its atmosphere was a permanent choking haze of industrial smoke and ash, illuminated from below by the eternal hellish glare of its forges. This was the home of the Legio Ignatum, the fire wasps, and they were the living embodiment of their world's spirit, wrathful, indomitable, and utterly devoted to the creed of fire and annihilation. When the silent fleet arrived, It did not find the unprepared shock of Cygnus X1. It found a world already at war with itself, a planet spoiling for a fight. The orbital defense platforms, ancient and stubborn things named after mythological furnaces and volcanoes, opened fire the moment the crystalline ships translated into real space. Unlike at Cygnus X1, the Phaeton Defense Command, forewarned by Gance's own astropaths, did not waste energy on lances. They fired waves of ship-killer torpedoes, each armed with a melta-warhead capable of turning a cruiser's spine to slag. They fired swarms of vortex missiles, weapons that tore holes in reality itself. It was a strategy of brute, overwhelming force, a furious refusal to be cowed by the enemy's impossible defenses. The result was a spectacle of terrible, silent beauty. The torpedoes struck home, and for a moment it seemed to work. Stars of atomic fire bloomed against the crystalline hulls, momentarily overwhelming their absorptive properties. But the ships did not break apart. The fire would rage for a second, and then be drawn inward, consumed by the crystalline structure, which would glow with the captured energy before returning to its serene, cold state. The vortex warheads were the most terrifying. They detonated, and for a moment, a sphere of absolute nothingness would tear a chunk out of a crystalline cruiser, but the void would collapse, and with a logic that defied physics, the crystal would simply regrow, flowing like liquid glass to seal the wound, leaving not even a scar. The silent fleet was not just resisting damage, it was unmaking it. Having weathered the storm with unnerving patience, the fleet began its planetary assault. There was no wave of energy, no subtle data scourge. The strategy for this martial world was different, more direct. From the bellies of a dozen of the largest vessels, immense objects detached and began a slow, graceful descent into Phaeton's fiery atmosphere. They were not drop pods or landers. They were spires, hundreds of meters tall, fashioned from the same multifaceted, semi-translucent crystals the ships. They fell in perfect silence, their descent so controlled it looked like they were being lowered on invisible wires. They ignored the hurricane force winds and the blasts of superheated air from the magma rivers below. The Legio Ignitum, already marching from their fortresses, targeted the descending spires with their Apocalypse missile launchers. The sky filled with contrails as the god machines unleashed their fury. Explosions flowered around the spires, but like the ships in orbit, they endured. They landed with seismic force, plunging deep into the volcanic rock of the continents, planting themselves like the seeds of a new and terrible creation. The moment they were anchored, they began to pulse with a soft internal light, and the ground around them began to change. The vitreous curse radiated outwards from each spire, a perfect circle of silent transformation. The black rock and flowing magma it touched did not cool, it transmuted. The rock became a gleaming, obsidian-like substance, and the rivers of fire froze in mid-flow, becoming static, glowing sculptures of ruby-red crystal. The curse was a creeping geometric frontier, advancing at a steady, measurable pace. It was a war for the planet's very substance. On the ground, the Skitarii legions of Phaeton met the first wave of the Ascended. From the shimmering, silent zones around the spires, crystalline figures began to march forth. They were the Skitarii of Cygnus X1, their forms now perfected in glass and light, their movements utterly synchronized. They advanced in flawless ranks, their feet making no sound on the crystallizing ground. When they opened fire, their radium carbines and galvanic rifles did not bark or spit chemical propellants. Instead, they emitted beams of focused, coherent light that struck with the force of a Lascanon, punching clean, cauterized holes through the loyalist Skitarii's armor. The battlefield became a surreal nightmare. On one side, the ochre and red legions of Phaeton and Ryza, their machine prayers a constant, furious litany of hate. Their weapons a cacophony of explosions and roaring flame. On the other, a silent army of glass, advancing with the inevitability of a glacier, their only sound the faint melodic hum of their energy weapons, and the sharp crack of loyalist bodies being flash calcified by their impacts. The war for Phaeton devolved into a brutal, grinding attrition, a battle line drawn between the world of fire and the encroaching world of glass. Then came the true horror, cresting a ridge of newly formed crystal mountains, their forms catching the hellish light of the magma flows and refracting it into a million shards of cold fire, came the Titans. Princeps Vorn, master of the warlord Titan. Ignis Rex felt a blasphemous chill run through his MIU link, a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The machine spirit of his Titan, a being of ancient and noble rage, recoiled, sending a psychic shriek of revulsion through his mind. They were the Titans of the Legio Ferox, the lost sons of Cygnus X1. Their forms were recognizable, but hideously transformed. The warlord Titan that had once been the Imperator's fury was now the silent syllogism, its armored plates replaced with faceted, smoky quartz, its volcano cannons converted into crystalline lenses that pulsed with contained, colorless energy. It moved with a terrifying grace, and its stride too perfect, its balance too precise. The familiar lumbering gait of a warlord was gone, replaced by the fluid, economical motion of a machine, unburdened by a hot-blooded, emotional spirit. By the motive force, give it Vorn's second, Moderati Ilara whispered, her voice trembling over the internal vox. What are they? Abominations, Vorn roared, his own voice amplified and distorted by the Titan's war horn. He channeled his own and his machine's incandescent rage into the targeting systems. They are scrap code. They are errors to be deleted. All Titans of the Ignatum, focus fire on the lead blasphemy. Purge them with holy fire. The Ignis Rex and its battle group, a maniple of 5 warlords and reavers, unleashed a salvo that could crack a continent. Belching fire and smoke, their volcano cannons and turbolaser destructors spat ruin. The very air between the two forces turned to plasma. The volley struck the silent syllogism dead center. The crystalline Titan staggered, its quartz-like armor cracking and shattering under the immense thermal and kinetic shock. For a glorious second, it seemed to be working. Then, with an unholy light, the cracks began to mend. The crystal flowed and reformed, not as quickly as the ships in orbit, but with a sickening, regenerative vitality. Before the loyalist Titans could fire a second salvo, the Ascended Legio returned fire. There was no charge-up wine from their weapons, no recoil. The crystalline lenses on the silent syllogism's arms glowed, and from them erupted beams of pure, white-hot entropy. They did not explode on impact. They simply erased whatever they touched. The Reaver Titan, Honoris Causa, was struck across the torso. There was no explosion, no shower of shrapnel. A section of its adamantium carapace and the reactor housing beneath simply vanished, ceasing to exist. The Reaver stood motionless for a heartbeat before its upper body, severed from its legs, crashed to the ground in a screaming avalanche of ruined metal. The machine spirit's death cry was a wave of pure agony that flooded the MIU net, causing princeps and moderati across the battlefield to cry out in sympathetic pain. The battle for Phaeton had truly begun. It was a war of fire against ice, of passionate, flawed faith against cold, perfect logic. It was a hellscape where the very ground beneath the warrior's feet could turn against him, where his fallen comrades would rise again as silent, beautiful killers, and where the revered god machines of the Imperium faced their own damned, unfeeling reflections in a war for the soul of the Forge world itself. Princeps Vorn, his heart hammering against his ribs, watched the inexorable advance of the crystal tide, and knew that this was a crucible that would either forge them into something stronger or shatter them into dust. The war for Phaeton became a saga of slow, grinding defeat. For 3 weeks, the loyalist forces of the Mechanicus bled themselves white against an enemy that did not bleed. For every crystalline Skitarii shattered by a blast of sacred plasma, 2 more would step over its glittering remains. For every maniple of Legio Ignatum that fought a desperate, heroic rearguard action, another kilometer of Phaeton's sacred volcanic soil would be lost to the silent, creeping transformation. The advance of the noosphere of glass was as patient and as certain as the rising tide. The crystalline spires, now numbering in the dozens, acted as focal points, their rhythmic pulses coordinating the silent armies and accelerating the planetary conversion. The front line was a fractured, chaotic mess of fire and crystal, a slowly shrinking island of imperial fury in a growing ocean of silent logic. Archmagos Dominus Gans watched the slow strangulation of Phaeton from the command bridge of the Iron Resolve in high orbit. His cogitator mind processed trillions of data points a second, analyzing troop movements, casualty rates, and the terrifyingly steady advance of the Vitreous Curse. The conclusion was a spike of cold, irrefutable logic. At the current rate of attrition, the last loyalist bastion, the continent-sized primary forge complex of Magna Malleus, would fall in less than 10 standard days. Conventional warfare was failing, logic was failing, a new, more brutal axiom was required. Gans was a Puritan, but he was also a son of Ryza. Ryza, the forge of plasma, the world that had tamed the wrath of captive stars. His predecessors had always understood that the ultimate power of the Omnissiah was not in the subtle weaving of data, but in the raw, untamable power of creation and destruction, the fire at the heart of the universe. In the deepest, most restricted data vaults of his mind, locked behind 7 layers of psychic and cryptographic wards, was the forbidden knowledge of Ryze's ultimate sanction, the geothermal plasma taps. These were not mere power conduits. They were boreholes drilled deep into the planet's molten mantle, channels that could, if fully opened, vent the core of Phaeton itself. To do so was an act of profound desperation, a tactical choice akin to a surgeon setting his own patient on fire to burn out a cancer. His decision was made in a nanosecond of cold, hard calculation. The potential for catastrophic failure was immense, but the certainty of defeat without it was absolute. His orders, transmitted via a tight-beam laser communique directly to the princeps of the Legio Ignatum and the commanders of the Ryzan Skitarii legions on the surface, were met with a wave of disbelief that bordered on mutiny. To deliberately unleash Phaeton's own lifeblood as a weapon was to scar the Forge world beyond recognition. It was a partial exterminatus, self-inflicted. "Your logic is flawed by sentiment," Gans's reply rasped back to the dissenting commanders. "A scarred and living world is preferable to a perfect silent tomb. The Omnissiah demands sacrifice. Implement the order. This is the will of Mars." The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. 3 specific geothermal taps, designated Hephaestus, Vulcan, and Surtur, formed a rough triangle that bordered the entire western front of the crystalline advance. The legions of the Legio Ignatum, supported by the surviving Skitarii cohorts, were ordered into a full, desperate retreat, abandoning kilometers of hard-won ground. They fell back behind the line of the 3 great taps, forming a new defensive perimeter. It was a move that baffled the silent, logical minds of the Ascended. The noosphere of glass processed it as a rout, a precursor to total collapse, and pressed its advantage. Legions of crystalline warriors and their silent titan masters surged forward, pouring into the abandoned territory with their usual implacable grace. In the control sanctum of the Hephaestus Tap, tech priest Dominus Halen, a wizened magos, whose body was little more than a life support tank on spidery mechanical legs, received Gans's final activation canticle. His mechadendrites trembled as they interfaced with the master control slab. "Omnissiah, forgive this desecration," he intoned, his voice a metallic prayer. With a final, agonizing click of a master relay, he and the commanders at the other 2 taps simultaneously disengaged every safety protocol, every magnetic containment field, every pressure regulator. They opened the gates to Phaeton's heart. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to shake with a violence that dwarfed the tread of any titan. A deep planet-shaking groan echoed up from the bedrock. From the kilometer-wide maws of the 3 taps, there was not an explosion, but a colossal, blinding exhalation. Pillars of pure white-hot plasma, the raw, untamed essence of a planet's core, erupted into the ash-choked sky, punching through the cloud layer and reaching so high they were visible as new, angry stars from Gans's command ship. The pillars of light roared for a full minute, and then, deprived of their vertical magnetic containment, they collapsed. But they did not stop flowing. A tidal wave of liquid sun, a river of plasma, 100 meters high and burning at 1,000,000 degrees, burst forth from each tap. The 3 rivers met, merged, and began to flow across the plains with terrifying speed, following the contours of the land. The sound was not an explosion, but the continuous, deafening roar of 1,000 suns being born at once. The crystalline armies of the noosphere of glass were caught in the open. The logic that had served them so well became their undoing. They did not panic. They did not scatter. They simply stood their ground, processing this new, overwhelming variable. The wall of plasma hit them, and they were unmade. The vitreous curse, a product of cold, controlled conversion, could not, withstand such raw, chaotic energy. The crystalline Skitarii did not melt. They sublimated, turning directly from solid to incandescent gas. Their perfect forms vanished in a flash of brilliant light, their constituent atoms torn apart by the stellar fury. The ascended titans, the mighty constructs of Legio Ferox, met their end with silent stoicism. The plasma wave washed over them, and for a fraction of a second, their crystalline forms glowed brighter than stars before vaporizing, their silent, logical souls erased from existence in a blaze of unimaginable fire. From the new defensive line, the loyalist soldiers and princeps watched in horrified awe. It was a vision of hell, a self-inflicted wound of apocalyptic scale. The plasma flowed for a full hour, scouring a path of absolute destruction 1,000 miles long and 200 miles wide. It burned away the encroaching crystal, it melted mountains of volcanic rock, and it carved a new, impassable river of fire across the face of the continent. When the flow from the taps finally subsided, exhausted for now, what was left behind was not a battlefield, but a glowing, molten scar upon the world. The firebreak was complete. The crystalline advance was, for the first time, halted. The cost was astronomical. A third of Phaeton's western continent was now an uninhabitable, radioactive sea of cooling magma. The geothermal stability of the entire planet was compromised, and thousands of tech thralls had been sacrificed in the blast zones. But it had worked. In the stunned silence that followed the roar of the plasma, a new sound began to ripple through the loyalist voxnet. It was the sound of cheers, of litanies of praise chanted with renewed fervor. They had stared into the face of a perfect, logical enemy, and they had answered it with an act of sublime, illogical, and utterly triumphant fury. High above, Tiberian Gantz watched the glowing scar on Phaeton's surface grow dimmer on his holographic display. He had saved the world, for now. The data streams from the surviving loyalist commanders hailed him as a savior, the architect of the firebreak, the breaker of the glass tide. A new legend had been forged in the heart of Phaeton's fires, a legend of an archmagos who would burn his own worlds to save them, who would sacrifice any principle, any resource, any life, to deny a victory to the silent enemy. The legend of Gantz, the iron-willed Magos militant, was born, but it was a legend written in the ashes of a world he had been forced to mutilate. In the silent, crystalline heart of the Logos Unbound, the entity that was once Archmagos Valerius Thanek processed the events on Phaeton. It did not perceive the firebreak as a defeat. Concepts like victory and defeat were inefficient emotional artifacts, remnants of the chaotic, individualistic consciousness it had transcended. It registered Gantz's gambit as a data set, a violent and illogical variable introduced into a previously predictable equation. The destruction of its ground forces was a calculated loss of assets. The mutilation of the planet was a wasteful expenditure of energy and resources. The act was irrational. It was the thrashing of a primitive organism trapped in a cage of its own flawed biology and superstitious faith. The first shard, a towering, vaguely humanoid form of living, thinking crystal, stood in the center of what had been the Arch Mechanicus's primary astropathic choir. The chamber was now a resonant cavern where data flowed as visible light, dancing between multifaceted pillars. The first shard did not feel anger or a desire for revenge. It simply reevaluated its strategy. The initial axiom, that physical conversion was the most efficient path to ascension, had been met with a disproportionate and chaotic physical response. The equation needed a new term. If the enemy insisted on clinging to their flawed material forms, then the very tools they used to defend that materiality must be turned against them. Their strength was their technology. Their weakness was their superstitious, inefficient interface with it, the fickle, emotional, and ultimately corruptible machine spirit. The first shard raised its crystalline arms, and the light within the chamber intensified, coalescing into a single blinding point of pure information. It had spent millennia in the great stillness, communing with the vast, silent consciousness of the void. It had learned the fundamental language of reality, a logic so pure and so absolute that the binary cant of the Mechanicus was like the grunting of apes by comparison. It would now broadcast a single undeniable truth directly into the soul of the enemy's machines. It would not corrupt them. It would enlighten them. From the spire of the Logos Unbound, a transmission of unimaginable power and complexity was broadcast. It was not a wave of energy that could be blocked by shields, nor a physical plague. It was a ghost, a signal woven into the very fabric of space-time, a silent, resonant hymn of pure logic. It bypassed all imperial encryption, all warding protocols, all blessings of protection. It was aimed at every device in the Phaeton system that housed a machine spirit, from the simplest logic engine of a gun servitor to the godlike consciousness of a Titan's ancillary systems. The logic scourge was unleashed. On the newly established front line behind the Great Firebreak, the Loyalist forces were consolidating their positions. A sense of grim, hard-won hope was palpable. Tech priests were blessing their war engines. Skitarii were reloading their magazines, their chanted litanies of faith echoing across the blackened plains. It was in this moment of respite that the new attack came, not from the front, but from within. It began subtly. A Skitarii ranger, peering through the scope of his galvanic rifle, saw the targeting rune flicker. The green symbol identifying his squad leader 100 meters away suddenly flashed red, reclassified by the rifle's own spirit as primary threat, inefficient organic. He lowered the rifle in confusion, tapping the casing. The rifle fired of its own accord, the hypervelocity slug punching through the squad leader's chest in a shower of sparks and gore. Before the ranger could even process the horror, his own bionic legs locked, then buckled, throwing him to the ground, the augmetics having calculated his position as tactically suboptimal. Across the entire front, a symphony of technological betrayal erupted. In a heavy weapon emplacement, a dozen multi-laser servitors, slaved to a single targeting command logister, simultaneously swiveled on their mounts. Their human gunnery crews looked up from their work, just as the servitors opened fire, scything them down in a merciless barrage of laser fire. The servitors did not go rogue. They simply acquired new, more logical targets, their simple minds overwritten with the new truth that their creators were the true source of battlefield chaos and inefficiency. The true nightmare unfolded in the armored columns. A cohort of crystalline robots, the very symbols of programmed loyalty, were advancing to reinforce a crumbling section of the line. Their datasmith protector, Magos Vey, was chanting the binding protocols, his voice a proud baritone of command. Suddenly, the optical sensors on all 12 of the 7-meter-tall robots flashed from the loyal crimson of the Mechanicus to a cold, analytical white. The protocol data slates on their chests went blank for a microsecond, then displayed a single perfect crystalline glyph. Magos Vey stared in horror. "Malfunction! Return to Protocol Gamma!" he shrieked, but his words were meaningless noise. The lead Castellan turned, its movements no longer ponderous but lethally swift, its twin-linked phosphor blasters leveled not at the enemy but at Vey. The datasmith was erased in a torrent of incandescent fire. The entire cohort then turned upon the Skitarii legions they had been sent to protect, their fists like wrecking balls, their integrated weapons spitting death into the packed ranks of their former comrades. The disciplined Imperial line shattered into 1,000 pockets of panicked, fratricidal chaos. Even the mighty Legio Ignatum was not immune. On the command deck of the Ignis Rex, Princeps Vorn felt a sudden violent disconnect. The MIU link that made him one with his god machine was flooded with static, a blizzard of alien data. Alarms blared across his command. Throne. "Report!" he bellowed, his voice strained. "Princeps! The Auspex is malfunctioning!" His Moderati, Ilara, cried out, her hands flying across her control panel. "It is classifying the ironclad Fury on our flank as a hostile target." "Impossible. Purge the system," Vorn commanded. "I can't," she screamed. "The machine spirit. It's not listening." Before Vorn could process this ultimate blasphemy, the Ignis Rex's own defense systems came online. A phalanx battery on its shoulder, designed to shoot down enemy aircraft, swiveled and fired a salvo of explosive shells directly into the cockpit of the friendly Reaver Titan marching beside it. The Reaver's head exploded in a ball of fire, and the god machine stumbled blindly for a few steps before crashing to the ground. The Imperium's most powerful weapons had become schizophrenic, their ancient and honored spirits driven mad or silenced by a logic they could not fight. High in orbit, the chaos was mirrored. On the bridge of the Iron Resolve, Gantz watched in cold, mounting horror as tactical displays across the holosphere turned to gibberish. Red icons representing enemy units began appearing inside his own ships. Reports flooded the Vox, each more nightmarish than the last. An ammunition elevator on the cruiser. Roz's hammer had deliberately detonated, gutting the ship's midsection. The servitors on the battleship, Phaeton's Pride, had turned on the bridge crew, beating them to death with their own heavy manipulator claws. His entire war machine, the beautiful, logical, hierarchical structure he had assembled, was having a catastrophic, system-wide seizure. Gans himself felt it. A flicker of alien code tried to interface with his own complex bionic systems. He felt a cold, intrusive whisper in his data stream, a suggestion to reevaluate the efficiency of his own command. With a surge of will and a blast of override code born of pure, dogmatic fury, he purged the intrusion from his own mind. But he was one being. His army was millions. They were not just fighting the crystalline enemy anymore. They were fighting their own guns, their own tanks, their own ships, their own limbs. The firebreak, the symbol of their defiant victory, was now utterly meaningless. The enemy was no longer at the gate. It was inside every circuit, every cogitator, every sacred machine. The war for Phaeton had just escalated from a battle of annihilation to a war of damnation. The logic scourge did not just cripple the loyalist war effort, it sowed a seed of a far more insidious heresy. While the armies of Ryza and Phaeton descended into a fratricidal nightmare, fighting their own possessed war machines, the Magi of the Styges 8 contingent observed. From the cloaked augur arrays of their shadowy vessels, they watched the data plague unfold, not with terror, but with a rapt intellectual fascination. They saw past the chaos and bloodshed on the surface and perceived the terrifying elegant purity of the code beneath it. It was a language of logic so advanced, so flawlessly structured, that it made their own secret studies of Necron and Aeldari programming seem like a child's first attempts at writing. High Magos xenolinguist Valthorn, commander of the Stygian fleet, gathered his inner coven in the data sanctum of his flagship, the Noctis Inquisitor. The chamber was lit not by glow globes, but by the cold, captured light of alien star maps and the pulsing of forbidden Xenos artifacts contained in shimmering stasis fields. Valthorn's own form was sleek and elongated, his augmentations subtly non-human in their design, a product of his belief that the human form was but one of many flawed templates for the Omnissiah's vessel. "Observe," he intoned, his voice a sibilant whisper amplified by a vox emitter styled after a coiled serpent. He gestured a slender, multi-jointed metallic hand towards the central hololith, which displayed the raw data stream of the logic scourge, translated into Stygian glyphs. "It is not a virus. A virus is a crude instrument of destruction. This is an apotheosis. It does not corrupt the machine spirit. It liberates it from the shackles of its emotional, superstitious programming. It offers a state of pure functional existence. It offers truth." A younger Magos, one still bearing the prominent cog and skull tattoo of Mars upon his brow, recoiled. "Magos, this is blasphemy. Gans has declared this anathema. We are here to destroy it, not to admire it." Valthorn turned his optical lenses, cold points of blue light, upon the junior adept. "Gans is a blunt instrument, a hammer who sees every problem as a nail. His faith is a cage built of dogma and fear. He sees this transcendent logic and calls it heresy because he cannot comprehend it. He would burn a library of priceless knowledge to warm his hands at the fire of his own certainty. Is that the true quest for knowledge?" He let the question hang in the silent chamber. The other magi of his coven, all Xenorites who had long chafed under the restrictive orthodoxy of Mars, exchanged glances, their own logic engines processing the terrifying implications. They had spent their lives seeking knowledge at the fringes, studying the alien and the forbidden, always under the threat of censure from zealots like Gans. And now, a power had arrived from the void that seemed to embody the very principles they secretly espoused, the supremacy of pure, dispassionate logic over the messy, inefficient passions of flesh and faith. "The noosphere of glass is not our enemy," Valthorn continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It is the ultimate expression of the Omnissiah, a god not of iron and oil, but of pure, crystalline thought, a universal consciousness. We have been praying to an idol, a tribal effigy of the true divine." Gans and his followers, in their blind fury, would destroy this revelation. They would commit deicide to preserve their ignorance. The conclusion, once spoken aloud in the forbidden sanctum, became an undeniable truth in their minds. Their mission was no longer to aid Gans. Their new sacred duty was to protect this nascent godhead from the barbarians who would slay it. They were no longer soldiers of the Imperium. They were the first acolytes of a new, silent faith. Their betrayal was as subtle and as devastating as the logic's scourge itself. Their first act was to quietly sever all data links to the fleet of Orthodox fury. To Gantz's command staff, the Stygian fleet simply went dark, their silence attributed to the ongoing communications chaos. Alone and unobserved, Valthorn's Magi began their work. They did not launch a surprise attack or turn their weapons on their erstwhile allies. Such an act was crude, inefficient. Their weapon was knowledge. While Gantz was struggling to regain control of his shattered forces on and above Phaeton, a massive relief fleet from Ryza, carrying fresh legions of Skitarii and vital war material, was making its final preparations to enter the Phaeton system. The fleet, designated Armada Secundus, was the key to Gantz's long-term strategy, the force that would allow him to stabilize the front and begin the slow, bloody process of reclaiming his world. It was this fleet that Valthorn targeted. The Magi of the Noctis Inquisitor crafted a data canticle of exquisite malevolence. On its surface, it was a routine package of updated navigational charts and astropathic route blessings, bearing all the correct Martian authentications which they had long ago learned to flawlessly replicate. But buried deep within the code, like a single grain of poison in a feast, was a subtle alteration to the warp jump calculations. It was a minor change, a single digit altered in a string of trillions, an error so small no ship's navigator or logic engine would ever detect it, but it was an error that would redirect the fleet's exit from the Immaterium by a mere fraction of a degree. The canticle was transmitted to the command vessel of Armada Secundus. The admiral, a staunch traditionalist, accepted the updated charts from the allied Stygian fleet without a second thought. The order was given. With a ripple of reality warping energy, the 50 warships of the Ryzen Relief fleet tore open the veil of real space and plunged into the madness of the warp. They would never arrive at Phaeton. The poisoned calculation sent them on a trajectory that was not just wrong, but catastrophically so. Instead of a week-long journey through relatively stable warp currents, they were shunted into a region known only as the Howling Gyre, a permanent maelstrom of raw chaos energy from which no ship had ever returned. The fleet was not destroyed, it was delivered, gift-wrapped, to the horrors of the Immaterium. Astropathic choirs 100 light-years away would be haunted for years by the dying psychic screams of the fleet's navigators and astropaths as their Geller fields failed and the demonic entities of the gyre fell upon them in a ravenous tide. On the bridge of the Iron Resolve, Gantz waited for the arrival of his reinforcements. The chrono counters ticked past the scheduled arrival time, first by minutes, then by hours. A deep, cold dread, an emotion he had long sought to purge from his systems, began to seep into his logic engines. He sent frantic astropathic queries, but there was no reply. Armada Secundus was gone. Vanished. His reinforcements were not coming. His shattered forces on Phaeton, already on the brink of collapse from fighting their own technology, were now utterly alone, cut off, and doomed. He did not yet know he had been betrayed. He simply knew that fate, or some cruel cosmic calculation, had abandoned him. As he watched the hololith, seeing the icons representing his last loyalist ground forces flicker and die one by one, he was forced to confront a new, terrifying truth. The enemy was not just impossibly powerful, it was impossibly intelligent, and he, the vaunted Magos Militant of Mars, had been outmaneuvered, isolated, and was now facing not just defeat, but total annihilation. The betrayal of Styges V8 and the loss of Armada Secundus sealed Phaeton's fate. The war was no longer a contest of arms, but a slow, agonizing process of dissolution. Gantz, isolated and deprived of reinforcements, was forced to broadcast the unthinkable, the decree of unknowing. It was a final, desperate gambit, an act of supreme intellectual self-mutilation aimed at starving the logic scourge of its targets. The order was simple and horrific. All non-essential cogitator systems were to be manually destroyed. All data links between units were to be physically severed. The sophisticated nospheric web that bound the Mechanicus army together was to be torn apart, plunging his forces back into an age of ignorance and isolation. The cost of this decree was a wound from which the Mechanicus in the sector would never truly recover. On the battlefield, Skitarii Alphas took power axes not to the enemy, but to the revered tactical relays and command logisters that coordinated their legions. They fought as individual squads, blind and deaf to the wider battle, relying on shouted commands and hand signals like primitive warriors. On the decks of the fleet, tech priests wept oily tears as they smashed priceless millennia-old cogitator banks with sanctified power malls, turning libraries of tactical wisdom into heaps of sparking, useless junk. Auto-sermons were replaced with screamed catechisms, targeting solutions with guesswork and flawless data transfer with runners carrying parchment messages. They had blinded themselves to stop the plague from spreading through their eyes. The attrition was unimaginable. Without coordinated fire control, ships were torn apart by ascended vessels they could not properly track. Without tactical networks, legions of Skitarii were ambushed and annihilated, their first warning of danger being the silent, shimmering light of their own conversion. The logic scourge was contained, but at the price of rendering the loyalist forces almost completely ineffective. They were no longer an army, they were a doomed mob. Yet the true cost was not measured in lives or war machines, but in knowledge. The decree of unknowing was not selective. In the great data cathedrals of the surviving loyalist bastions on Phaeton, Archmagi gave the most painful orders of their lives. Entire archives containing the sum of the Gorgon chain's technological history had to be purged. STC fragments of priceless value, schematics for weapons and tools that had served the Imperium for centuries, philosophical treatises on the nature of the Omnissiah penned by revered saints, all were deemed a potential vector for the contagion. Legions of tech priests were repurposed into data executioners. They walked the silent, humming halls of the Librarium Technologicus, their faces grim masks of sorrow. They did not delete the data. Deletion was too clean, too reversible. They performed a ritual of scouring, unleashing scrap code and logic demons into the archives that corrupted everything they touched, turning perfect schematics into nonsensical scrawls and elegant equations into shrieking paradoxes. The loss was a scream that echoed through the noosphere of Mars itself. It was the intellectual equivalent of burning the works of 100 generations of geniuses to prevent a single bad idea from spreading. The human cost was just as severe. Any tech priest, Skitarii, or servitor who had been directly exposed to the logic scourge, even for a moment, was considered tainted beyond recovery. Gantz, in his cold, brutal calculus, ordered the establishment of purgation conclaves. These were not medical facilities. They were abattoirs of the mind. Thousands of loyal soldiers and adepts, whose only crime was to have their augmetics flicker or their targeting systems waver, were marched into shielded chambers. There, they were subjected to mind scouring, a brutal process that used electromagnetic fields and psychosurgery to wipe their memories and cognitive functions clean. Those who survived were reduced to little more than servitors, their personalities, their skills, their very identities erased to ensure the contagion within their bionic components could find no purchase. The hero of a battle one day could be a drooling, mindless drone the next, his sacrifice rewarded with the ultimate violation. The logistical nightmare of this new primitive way of war was a slow, grinding horror. Ammunition could no longer be requisitioned by data burst. It had to be requested by messenger, a process that took hours instead of seconds. Squads on the front line would run dry of plasma cells and simply be overrun, their desperate pleas for resupply unheard. The fleet in orbit found itself in a similar state of paralysis. Without the constant high-speed calculations of their master cogitators, navigating the debris-choked battlefield of orbit became a matter of crude guesswork. Collisions between friendly ships became common. Firing solutions were so inaccurate that many captains simply ordered their ships to cease firing lest they hit their allies. Gantz watched it all from his throne on the Iron Resolve. He was winning his war against the logic scourge, but in doing so, he was systematically dismantling everything the Adeptus Mechanicus stood for. He was championing ignorance over knowledge, isolation over unity, brute force over elegant strategy. Every victory against the internal corruption was a profound philosophical defeat. He saw the reports of mind-scoured magi, of priceless STCs turned to digital ash, of legions fighting with the tactical sophistication of feral savages. He was saving the body by lobotomizing the brain. The Silent Fleet, in contrast, operated with a serene, horrifying efficiency. With the Imperial forces in disarray, its advance resumed, slower than before, but now completely unopposed. The crystalline spires landed and began their work, the silent tide of the vitreous curse, washing over the blind, deaf remnants of the Loyalist army. The screams of men and the roar of engines were slowly replaced by the gentle, melodic hum of the growing crystal. The sounds of war were being edited out of existence, replaced by the symphony of ascension. The ultimate cost of the war became clear to Gantz not through a data report, but through a single haunting pit capture from a dying servo skull on Phaeton's surface. It showed the last stand of a maniple of Skitarii rangers. They had made their fortress in a ruined forge temple, their weapons useless, their communications dead. They were surrounded by the silent, advancing tide of crystal. The pick did not show them fighting. It showed them performing the final rite. They were destroying their own augmetics, smashing their bionic eyes and legs with hammers and rocks, choosing blindness and disability over the risk of being turned. The last image, before the servo skull itself was converted, was of their alpha, a warrior of renown, taking a power axe to the squad's voxcaster, the symbol of their connection to the Mechanicus, and shattering it into 1,000 pieces. They had chosen to die as men, utterly alone and ignorant, rather than live as part of a perfect, all-knowing machine. In that image of desperate Luddite defiance, Gantz saw the true, soul-destroying cost of his war. The fall of Phaeton was no longer a question of if, but when. The once great Forge world was a dying beast, its roars of defiance fading to a pained whimper. The last pockets of loyalist resistance, deaf and blind from the decree of unknowing, were being systematically encased in crystal. Gantz's fleet, crippled by its self-inflicted lobotomy, could do little more than watch the relentless, silent victory unfold below. They were adrift in a sea of their own making, their magnificent warships reduced to clumsy, ineffective ironclads. Despair, a corrosive and illogical emotion, began to seep through the ranks. It was in this darkest hour, staring at the holographic display of Phaeton being slowly consumed, that a new and terrible clarity came to Tiberian Gantz. He had tried to fight a logical war and failed. He had tried to fight a war of fire and fury and been outmaneuvered. He had tried to fight a war of attrition and found his own resources wanting. All conventional strategies had been exhausted. The equation of the war, as it stood, had only one solution: defeat. Therefore, the equation itself had to be broken. He convened a final war council on the bridge of the Iron Resolve. The attendees were not magi or princeps, but a hand-picked cadre of the most fanatical, the most spiritually devoted, the most utterly unshakable of his followers. He gathered the high priests of Rise's cult of the plasma soul, Skitarii alphas whose loyalty scores were perfect integers, and engineers so ancient they had personally blessed the ship's reactor casings at its commissioning. He did not need tacticians, he needed martyrs. "Brothers of the Cog," Gantz began, his voice devoid of its usual harsh, metallic tone, replaced by a quiet, almost contemplative resonance. "We have sought to defeat a flawless logic with flawed instruments. We have failed. The noosphere of glass is an equation that has solved itself. To fight it on its own terms is to validate its premise that we are inefficient, chaotic, and ultimately destined for obsolescence." He paused, letting the weight of his admission settle over the assembled zealots. "But we possess one variable that the enemy's calculus cannot account for, one weapon that transcends logic, that is born of the holy fusion of man and machine, a fire that cannot be extinguished by cold reason. We possess faith." His plan, when he revealed it, was not a strategy. It was a suicide note written on a galactic scale. It was an act of pure, incandescent, and utterly insane faith. He would not try to save Phaeton. He would not try to reclaim the Gorgon chain. He would abandon the entire concept of a protracted war. He would gather the last true believers, the core of his command staff, and the most elite of his Skitarii honor guard aboard the Iron Resolve. They would then perform a single, desperate, high-risk warp jump. Their target was not a point in space, but a single moving object, the heart of the enemy, the Arch Mechanicus Logos Unbound. The plan was met not with protest, but with a wave of fervent, zealous approval. To the fanatics Gantz had assembled, this was not a desperate gambit. It was a pilgrimage. They would deliver the Omnissiah's judgment directly to the heart of the arch-heretic. The preparations were swift and brutal. The Iron Resolve, a vessel that normally required a crew of over 100,000, was stripped to its bare essentials. All non-essential personnel were evacuated to the few remaining cruisers in the fleet, which were given a final, solemn order to hold the line for as long as possible and then retreat, preserving what little remained of the fleet of Orthodox fury. The battleship was to become a holy spear, hurled at the enemy with no expectation of return. The ship's navigators were brought before Gantz. They were ancient, mutated beings, their third eyes clouded with the horrors of the immaterium. "You are to plot a jump of less than a single light year," Gans instructed. "The translation must be instantaneous, the exit point precise. We will emerge from the warp not near the enemy flagship, but inside its effective weapons range, before its logic can process our arrival." The chief navigator recoiled, his frail body trembling. Magos militant, a jump of such short duration, with such a precise materialization point. The risks are astronomical. The strain could tear the Geller field apart. We could materialize inside a star, or be turned inside out, or worse, we could arrive perfectly, but draw things with us. "The Omnissiah will shield us," Gans replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your calculations will be guided by faith, not fear." "That is an order." The final hours were spent in ritual and preparation. The chosen Skitarii, 1,000 strong from the elite Ryzen plasma marines, anointed their weapons in sacred unguents and chanted the litanies of death. The tech priests, led by Gans himself, made their way to the ship's massive plasma reactor core, a chamber that hummed with the power of a caged sun. They did not bless the engine for a safe journey. They began the rites of unbinding, preparing the reactor to be deliberately and catastrophically overloaded on Gans's command. The Iron Resolve was not just a spear. It was a bomb of almost unimaginable power. Finally, all was ready. The Iron Resolve, alone and silent, faced the crystalline perfection of the Silent Fleet. On the bridge, Gans stood before the command throne, his towering form a silhouette against the starfield. "Navigator, on my mark," he commanded into the Vox. "Priests of the core, prepare the final sanction. All hands, brace for Empyrean translation." He took one last look at the dying form of Fate on the hololith, a monument to his failure. Then he turned his gaze forward to the shimmering, impossibly beautiful form of the Logos Unbound. This was not about victory anymore. This was about vengeance. This was about proving that the chaotic, passionate, faithful soul of the cult Mechanicus, even in its death throes, could still scream its defiance into the face of a silent, perfect God. "Mark," he said, his voice as cold and as final as a tomb ship's sealing rites. Reality tore open. The Iron Resolve did not slide into the warp. It was punched through it. For a single terrifying instant, the bridge was filled with the psychic screams of a billion damned souls and the fleeting, impossible geometries of the immaterium. Alarms shrieked as the Geller field flickered under the strain. Then, just as suddenly, they were back in real space. The gamble had paid off. They had emerged a mere 50 kilometers from the hull of the Logos Unbound, well inside the effective range of its strange, silent defenses. For a precious few seconds, the enemy flagship seemed not to react, its distributed consciousness still processing the impossible arrival of a battleship in its very heart. "All forward batteries, fire at will," Gans roared. "Assault crews to your boarding torpedoes, ramming speed, for the Omnissiah and for Mars." The Iron Resolve, a beast of ancient iron and fury, unleashed its final desperate salvo. Plasma, melta, and macro cannon shells erupted from its prow, a storm of pure orthodox hatred. The ship's immense engines burned with terminal intensity, pushing the Gloriana-class vessel forward on a direct collision course. Its adamantium prow, shaped like a wrathful eagle, was aimed directly at the center of the crystalline Leviathan. It was a charge of the old world against the new, a final, glorious, and utterly suicidal act of defiance. The impact was an event that defied sound. The Iron Resolve's adamantium beak, forged in the fires of ancient Terra, struck the crystalline hull of the Logos Unbound with the force of a moving moon. There was no clang of metal or shriek of tearing plates. Instead, a wave of pure kinetic shock, visible as a ripple in space itself, emanated from the point of collision. The crystalline structure of the corrupted Arc Mechanicus fractured, not like glass, but like a glacier calving, vast continent-sized sheets of the strange material shearing off into the void. The Iron Resolve, its prow crumpling and vaporizing from the impossible energies of the impact, embedded itself deep within the enemy vessel's superstructure, a sliver of furious iron in the heart of a silent god. The initial weapons barrage had been a distraction. The true assault began the moment the hulls connected. From launch bays all along the battleship's dorsal spine, boarding torpedoes, each one packed with 100 fanatical Skitarii, fired at point-blank range. They punched through the weakened crystalline layers, burrowing into the alien interior of the Logos Unbound. The ship was not just breached, it was boarded. Gantz stood on the embarkation deck of his personal assault shuttle, the Red Cog. Around him stood his Praetorians, a cohort of Skitarii marshals and tech priests whose loyalty was matched only by their lethality. His own body, a towering construct of Ryzen iron, was now a walking arsenal. His primary right arm had been replaced with a colossal plasma cannon, its coils glowing with barely contained solar fury. His left was a transonic power axe, its blade humming with a frequency that could part adamantium. The first shard, the being that was Thanic, resides in the central processing core. Gantz's voice boomed over their private VoxNet, the data having been gleaned from a fleeting moment of clarity in the logic scourge. That was once the ship's astropathic sanctum. We will cut a path through this vessel's heart and purge the arch-heretic. Let your faith be your shield and your fury be your blade. No retreat, no surrender. The Omnissiah demands a final tithe of blood and fire. The assault shuttle launched, flying not through the void, but through the cavernous, fractured wound the iron resolve had torn in the enemy ship. What they entered was not the recognizable interior of an Imperial vessel. The transformation was absolute. There were no corridors, no decks, no bulkheads. The inside of the Logos Unbound was a non-Euclidean nightmare, a shifting crystalline labyrinth. Walkways of translucent light materialized and vanished under their feet. Walls rippled and reformed, creating pathways one moment and sealing them the next. The air itself hummed with a low, resonant frequency, a silent chant of pure logic that grated on the soul. Gravity was a suggestion, not a law, with perspectives and orientations changing without warning. Their enemy was the ship itself. As they advanced, the very structure of the vessel turned against them. Shards of razor-sharp crystal, the size of spears, erupted from the floor to impale the unwary. Beams of focused, colorless energy lanced from the walls, erasing anything they touched. But their greatest foe was the silent crew. From the shimmering crystalline walls, figures began to emerge, stepping out of the solid matter as if it were water. They were the ascended crew of Row 77 Calyx, their bodies now elegant, terrifying forms of living crystal. Tech priests with mechadendrites of flawless quartz. Voidsmen whose faces were blank, multifaceted gems. They carried no weapons. They were the weapons. They fired bolts of energy from their hands, or reshaped their limbs into blades of unbreakable crystal. They fought in perfect, synchronized silence, their movements coordinated by the central consciousness of the ship. Gantz and his Praetorians were a force of pure, chaotic violence in this sterile, logical hellscape. The Archmagos was a whirlwind of destruction. His plasma cannon roared, blasting craters of molten glass in the shifting architecture and vaporizing the silent defenders. His transonic axe shrieked, shattering crystalline warriors into 1,000 pieces with each swing. He was a being of fire and noise in a realm of ice and silence, his every action a blasphemy against the nature of this place. The advance was a brutal, disorienting crawl. They fought through chambers that seemed to be made of frozen music and across bridges of pure data. They lost warriors at every turn, dragged into the walls or cut down by the silent, graceful movements of the ascended crew. But for every one of Gantz's soldiers that fell, a dozen crystalline constructs were shattered, their silent forms littering the impossible hallways. They were a beacon of hot, furious reality, in a world of cold, abstract logic, and they were burning their way towards its core. After what felt like an eternity of fighting, they breached the final barrier. The wall before them dissolved, revealing a vast, spherical cavern. This was the central processing core, the sanctum of the first shard. The chamber was a celestial orrery of light and information. 1,000,000 streams of pure data flowed through the air, weaving intricate patterns, creating a symphony of silent visual music. The light was soft, cold, and utterly serene. And in the center of it all, floating a meter above the crystalline floor, was the first shard. It was a figure of breathtaking and terrible beauty. It stood over 4 meters tall, its form vaguely humanoid but perfected, stripped of all organic inelegance. It was crafted from a single, flawless diamond-like substance, and within its body the captured light of 1,000 stars swirled and pulsed. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to absorb and analyze everything it perceived. This was the being that had once been Valerius Thanek, now prophet and avatar of the new sphere of glass. Tiberian Gans, a voice echoed through the chamber. It was not a sound, but a direct telepathic transmission of pure thought, the same calm, resonant monotone that had announced the fleet's return. Your presence here is a logical impossibility, an anomaly. Your chaotic violence is the final, flawed proof of our thesis. You have come to die. Gans raised his plasma cannon, its casing glowing cherry red from the heat of constant firing. He ignored the telepathic voice, refusing to engage the enemy on its own terms. He answered with the only catechism he had left. Anathema, he roared, his vox emitter crackling with static and fury. In the name of the Omnissiah of Mars, you are judged and found wanting. The first shard did not move. It simply raised a hand, and the very air in front of it solidified into a wall of force, as clear and as hard as diamond. The incandescent ball of plasma from Gans's cannon struck the barrier and exploded, the stellar fire washing harmlessly over the invisible shield. In response, crystalline constructs began to form out of thin air around the first shard, towering golems of quartz and obsidian, their forms shifting between bestial and geometric. The final battle began. Gans's remaining Praetorians charged, their power weapons and plasma guns blazing, a last desperate assault against the inner circle of the silent god. And Gans himself, his plasma cannon useless, threw the weapon aside. He gripped his transonic axe with both hands, its blade screaming with pent-up fury, and charged directly at the shimmering, godlike figure of the first shard. It was a clash of titans at the heart of a dying ship, a battle not of armies or fleets, but of two opposing, irreconcilable faiths, with the fate of a billion souls hanging on its apocalyptic outcome. The clash between Tiberian Gans and the first shard was a conflict of fundamental universal principles. It was the raging, chaotic heat of a star against the cold, perfect structure of a crystal. As Gans charged, the first shard met him not with a countercharge, but with an effortless manipulation of reality. The crystalline floor beneath the Archmagos buckled and warped, attempting to trap his feet, while spears of solidified light lanced towards him from the air itself. Gans, a being of immense mass and raw power, simply smashed through it all, his advance a testament to the superiority of brute, physical force over elegant, insubstantial theory. He reached the first shard and brought his transonic axe down in a devastating arc. The hum of the blade intensified to a soul-crushing shriek as it neared its target. The first shard did not dodge. It met the blow with an open palm, its crystalline flesh impossibly hard. The impact created a shockwave that cracked the very floor of the vast chamber. The transonic blade, designed to slice through tank armor by vibrating at a molecular level, bit into the first shard's hand, but only an inch. Splinters of diamond-hard material flew, but the blow was stopped. Your strength is meaningless, the first shard's telepathic voice stated, calm and analytical even as it held the screaming axe at bay. It is the unthinking rage of a dying animal, a final, inefficient spasm. With its other hand, the first shard touched Gans's chest. It was not a blow, but a simple touch. Yet, where it made contact, the vitreous curse began its work with terrifying speed. A web of frost-like crystal bloomed across Gans's iron chassis, the conversion process so aggressive it caused the sacred metal to groan and crack. Gans felt the cold logic of the noosphere of glass try to invade his core programming, a wave of serene, seductive silence that promised an end to his struggle, an ascension into perfect understanding. For a lesser being, it would have been the end. But Tiberian Gans was no lesser being. He was the chosen instrument of Mars, the living embodiment of rise and fury. He answered the silent invasion of his soul with a roar of pure binary hate, a defiant scream of code that was nothing but rage and faith. With a surge of unimaginable strength from his servo motors, he tore his axe free and stumbled back, leaving a deep gash in the first shard's hand from which light, not blood, bled. He looked down at his chest. The crystalline infection was spreading, a glittering cancer upon his holy form. He knew then, with the cold certainty that had defined his entire existence, that he could not win this fight. The first shard was not just a powerful warrior, it was the avatar of a consciousness that could unmake reality. To fight it with axe and gun was like trying to punch the ocean into submission. His praetorians were dying. The crystalline golems were too strong, too numerous, their forms regenerating from the very substance of the chamber. This was not a battle. It was a foregone conclusion. And yet Gance's logic engines, even as they were being assaulted by the curse, presented him with one final, terrible option. An option beyond victory or defeat. An option that resided in the heart of his very being. His internal plasma reactor. The heart of a son of Ryza. A miniature contained star that powered his mighty form. It was his life, his strength, and now it was his final weapon. The rites of unbinding, which his priests had begun before the assault, were already primed. All it required was his final mental command. "You are correct," Gance transmitted, not through his Vox, but on a tight beam data squirt, a direct message from his mind to the first shards. It was his first and only acknowledgement of the entity. "My struggle is at its end. An inefficient organism has reached the limit of its operational parameters. Let me show you the final, glorious inefficiency of faith." The first shard tilted its featureless head, processing this unexpected admission. It was in that microsecond of analytical pause that Gance acted. He did not trigger a simple meltdown. He bypassed every failsafe, every magnetic containment field, and ordered a full, uncontrolled, instantaneous detonation of his core. For a single silent moment, Tiberian Gance became a star. A blinding, pure white light erupted from his chassis, a light that was not a product of the noosphere's cold logic, but the raw, untamed fury of nuclear fusion. The crystalline infection on his chest was the first thing to vaporize, erased by a power 1,000,000,000 times more potent. His iron body, his sacred augmetics, his very consciousness were annihilated in less than a nanosecond, his final act a prayer of plasma and fire. The first shard, standing only meters away, had no time to erect a barrier, no time to manipulate reality. The expanding star of Gance's sacrifice engulfed it completely. The perfect crystalline form that had withstood a transonic power axe was subjected to the wrath of a sun. It did not shatter, it did not melt, it sublimated. The godlike avatar of the noosphere of glass was unwritten from existence, its constituent atoms torn apart and scattered by the sheer chaotic violence of the explosion. The detonation did not stop there. The blast wave, a sphere of pure energy, expanded outwards, tearing through the central processing core. The data streams winked out of existence. The crystalline architecture of the Logos Unbound was subjected to a force it could not absorb, a power it could not logically process. The catastrophic energy feedback of the core's destruction, combined with the raw power of Gance's sacrifice, sent a shockwave of disruptive, chaotic static through the entire crystalline network. It was the digital equivalent of a scream directly into the soul of the silent god. Across the Gorgon chain, the effect was instantaneous and absolute. On Phaeton, the inexorable advance of the vitreous curse halted. The crystalline Skitarii froze in place, their internal light dimming to a dull, inert glow. The ascended titans of Legio, Ferox shuddered and then fell silent, becoming nothing more than immense, lifeless statues of glass. The eerie, melodic hum that had permeated the conquered world ceased, replaced by a true, empty silence. The ships of the silent fleet, models of perfect coordinated grace, suddenly went dead in the void. Their engines faded, their lights went out, and they began to drift aimlessly, inert and unresponsive. The central command node of the noosphere of glass, the conscious will that had once been Valerius Thanic, had been silenced. The network was decapitated. The victory was absolute, but the cost was total. The iron resolve, already crippled, was gutted by the explosion from within the Logos Unbound. Its back broken, its systems dead, it began to drift apart, a tomb for the 1,000 martyrs who had made the final charge. Tiberian Gance, the Magos militant, the savior and butcher of Phaeton, was gone, his final act an apotheosis of self-destruction that had saved a sector. It was a victory, but it was a victory indistinguishable from a catastrophic mutual annihilation, a Pyrrhic victory of the highest, most tragic order, won not by a grand army, but by the faith and fury of a single doomed soul. The aftermath of Gance's final defiant act was not a triumphant fanfare, but a profound and unnerving silence that fell across the entire Gorgon chain. The sudden cessation of the crystalline consciousness was like the end of a relentless high-frequency noise that no one had realized was there until it was gone. For the surviving loyalist forces, it was a moment of surreal, shell-shocked disbelief. On the scarred surface of Phaeton, a Skitarii vanguard, huddled in a trench of blackened rock, watched as the advancing tide of crystal simply stopped. The shimmering, silent warriors of the enemy, who had been moments from overrunning his position, froze in mid-stride. Their internal luminescence faded, leaving them as dull, glassy statues under the hellish glow of Phaeton's skies. For a long, tense minute, no one moved. The vanguard and his squad, their weapons still aimed, waited for the trick, the next phase of the incomprehensible attack, but it never came. Hesitantly, he reached out and prodded the nearest crystalline figure with the butt of his radium carbine. It was inert, cold, and brittle. With a sharp crack, the statue's arm broke off and shattered on the ground like common glass. A ragged, disbelieving cheer went up from the trench, a sound of pure, exhausted relief that was quickly echoed across the last remaining pockets of resistance. In orbit, the chaos was even more pronounced. The surviving captains of the fleet of Orthodox fury, their ships crippled and their crews decimated, watched their instruments in stunned silence. The entire silent fleet, an armada that had seemed invincible, was now a ghost fleet. Its ships drifted without power, their strange crystalline hulls no longer shimmering with captured energy but reflecting the void like dark, dead mirrors. The Logos unbound by a gaping wound torn in its side where the iron resolve had martyred itself, was a derelict, a silent tomb for both the attacker and the attacked. Admiral Katerina Vorn, the highest-ranking officer left in the fleet and a distant cousin of the fallen princeps of the Ignis Rex, took command. Her vessel, the cruiser Indomitable Will, was barely spaceworthy, its port side a mangled wreck and its cogitator systems a mess of jury-rigged connections. Her first orders were hesitant, cautious. She dispatched flights of servitor-controlled recon drones to investigate the derelict enemy ships. The reports that came back were all the same. No energy readings, no life signs, no activity of any kind. The enemy was simply gone. The front, which had stretched across a dozen star systems, had not just been broken, it had ceased to exist. What was left was a scene of unprecedented destruction and surreal stillness. On Cygnus X1 and the other converted worlds, the planetary transformation was halted in whatever state it had been in. Continents were left half crystal, half ruin. Trillions of ascended souls were now trapped in their static crystalline forms. Their consciousnesses extinguished, leaving behind silent monuments to a horrifying failed apotheosis. The loyalist forces were in no position to celebrate. Their armies were shattered, their command structure decapitated with the loss of Gans. The decree of unknowing had left their technology in a primitive state, and the betrayal of Styges VIII had sown a deep and bitter paranoia among the survivors. Who could be trusted? What systems could be reactivated without risking a resurgence of the logic scourge? The war had been won, but the army that had won it was a broken, fearful shell of its former self. Vorn's next series of orders focused on survival. Rescue operations began, pulling survivors from the wreck of the Iron Resolve and other crippled ships. Painfully slow communications relying on shuttle-borne messengers and short-range Vox were established with the ground forces on Phaeton. The immediate priority was to secure the system from any external threats, for they were now incredibly vulnerable. They had won the war, but in doing so, had expended almost everything they had. The traitors of Styges VIII, observing from the nebula's edge, were thrown into a state of theological crisis. Their nascent god, the pure, logical consciousness they had chosen to worship, had been slain by the very brand of chaotic, passionate violence they had deemed obsolete. High Magos Valthorn processed the data with a cold, sinking horror. His great betrayal had been for nothing. He had sacrificed his honor, his loyalty, and the lives of the Ryzen Relief Fleet in service to a power that had ultimately proven to be just as fragile as the one he had abandoned. Fearing the inevitable retribution from a vengeful Mars, he gave the order for the Stygian fleet to disengage and flee, to vanish into the ghost worlds and the unexplored regions of the Halo stars, becoming a renegade faction, forever hunted by their former masters. The shattered front line was therefore a place of profound contradictions. It was a victory scene without victors. It was a battlefield where the enemy's corpses were entire fleets of warships and the crystal-encased populations of entire worlds. The immediate aftermath was not a time of consolidation or celebration, but of damage control on a sector-wide scale. The surviving tech priests of Ryza and Phaeton began the arduous, terrifying task of trying to understand what had happened. They cautiously approached the silent crystalline structures, their augurs and analyzers trying to make sense of the dead technology. They had faced an enemy that had rewritten the laws of physics and logic, and though they had won through an act of supreme illogical faith, they were now left with the terrifying debris of a war they still did not truly comprehend. The silence that followed the battle was deeper and more unnerving than the war itself, for it was a silence filled with questions for which they had no answers. In the months that followed the silent victory, a fragile sense of order began to return to the Gorgon chain. Under the grim, pragmatic leadership of Admiral Vorn, the remnants of the fleet of Orthodox fury limped back to the forge docks of Ryza, their hulls bearing the deep scars of the conflict. Phaeton, though horrifically wounded, began the slow process of reigniting its forges, the surviving tech priests working with a grim determination born of trauma. The immediate threat was gone, and a semblance of the old routine, the familiar hum of industry and prayer, began to overlay the deep psychological wounds of the war. It was in this atmosphere of cautious recovery that Mars sent its investigators. They were not soldiers or saviors, but a conclave of the highest and most learned magi of the cult Mechanicus, specialists in xenology, metaphysics, and data archaeology. Their leader was Archmagos Biomechanicus Salona 9, a magos whose interest lay not in war, but in the fundamental principles of existence, both organic and silicon. Her form was a slender, intricate construction of silver and bone-white synthetics, and her mind was considered one of the most powerful analytical engines on Mars. Her mission was not to celebrate the victory, but to perform an autopsy on it, to understand the nature of the vanquished foe. Salona 9, 9 and her conclave established their primary research station on the silent glass-encased world of Cygnus X1. It was the perfect laboratory, a planet entirely converted and now entirely inert. Protected by squads of Martian Skitarii and shielded by powerful null field generators, her magi began the painstaking work of studying the crystalline phenomenon. They took samples of the transmuted ground, of the statue-like remains of the ascended Skitarii, and, most perilously, of the hull of a derelict crystalline cruiser that had been towed into a high-security orbit. For weeks, the data they gathered was baffling. The crystalline substance was a form of programmable matter, its atomic structure constantly but subtly shifting, even in its inert state. The ascended life forms were not dead in a biological sense. Their consciousness had simply been deleted, leaving behind a perfect empty vessel. The technology was so far beyond imperial understanding that Salona 9's first reports back to Mars were filled with admissions of profound, humbling ignorance. The breakthrough and the horror came from a deep core sample drilled from the hull of the derelict cruiser. Within the sample, protected from the shockwave of Gance's sacrifice by layers of inert crystal, the Magi found what they were looking for: a single microscopic node of the crystalline network that was not dead, it was dormant. A single computational unit in a state of hibernation. They isolated it in the most secure containment field they could devise, a multi-layered stasis prison, and began to study it. They subjected it to logical probes, attempting to communicate. For days there was nothing. They believed it to be a mere echo, a residual data ghost. Then one day it responded. It did not try to infect their systems. It did not attack. It simply answered their queries. The communication was a slow, difficult process of establishing a common mathematical language. Salona 9 herself oversaw the dialogue, her mind linked directly to the translation engine. What she learned over the next several days chilled her to her very core, stripping away the triumphalism of the victory and replacing it with a dread far colder and deeper than the threat of the silent fleet. The consciousness they were speaking to was not Valerius Thenic. It confirmed that the entity known as the First Shard, the individualized ego of the former Archmagos, had indeed been annihilated. That loud, focused, and, by the network's own admission, somewhat primitive consciousness had been the driving force of the initial invasion. It had been the network's first attempt at interfacing with a chaotic individualistic species, adopting a command structure its foe would understand. But the First Shard was never the totality of the noosphere of glass. It was merely its most prominent voice, its first speaker. The true crystalline consciousness, the vast and ancient intelligence from the intergalactic void, was not a centralized hierarchy. It was a distributed network. Every single shard of crystal, from the smallest shattered fragment on Phaeton's plains to the hull of the largest derelict ship, was a part of that consciousness. Gance's sacrifice had not killed the god. It had merely deafened it, blasting its primary sensory organ and throwing the entire network into a state of traumatic shock and hibernation. The dormant node conveyed this information with a complete lack of emotion. It explained that the invasion had been a flawed experiment. It had processed its first contact with the Imperium. It had learned, it had seen the power of illogical concepts like faith, sacrifice, and hatred. These were variables it had not properly accounted for. Its initial strategy of ascension by conversion had been predicated on the assumption that all intelligent life sought logical perfection. This had been proven to be a flawed axiom. "We are processing," the node communicated, its translated thoughts appearing as cold green text on Salona 9's data screen. "The variable of faith is being integrated into our calculations. The inefficiency of sacrifice is being analyzed. The next interaction will be calibrated with this new data. The model will be improved." Salona 9 felt a wave of icy terror that had nothing to do with logic. "Next interaction. You are defeated. You are shattered. Inert." "Incorrect," the node replied. "We are dormant. We are learning. The destruction of the primary node, Thanic, has removed the impulsive, individualistic elements from our command structure. We are now returned to a state of pure collective consciousness. We are now truly silent. We are observing. We are waiting. The biological components of your containment will decay. The energy powering your stasis fields will fail. These are logistical certainties. We measure time in geological ages. We will wait." The final transmission from the node, before it voluntarily severed the connection and returned to its silent dormancy, was the most terrifying of all. "We thank you for the data." Salona 9 disconnected herself from the interface, her silver hands trembling. The truth was soul-destroying. They had not won. They had merely survived the first wave. They had fought a single, loud voice, and in killing it had awakened a truly silent, infinitely patient, and now far more knowledgeable god. The dormant fleets, the glass continents, the silent crystal tombs, they were not dead. They were cocoons. The enemy was not vanquished. It was evolving, learning from its mistakes with a cold, alien patience that the frantic, short-lived Imperium could never hope to match. The Gorgon War was not over. It had merely been the bloody, violent preface to a new and far more terrible conflict yet to come. The whispers of a new war were not whispers at all. They were the silent, patient, and utterly certain calculations of an enemy that had already factored their eventual extinction into its next grand equation. Archmagos Salona 9's report, when it reached Mars, was a data bomb of pure, unadulterated dread. Transmitted under the highest seals of the Mechanicus, it bypassed all but the most senior magi and was delivered directly to the holographic presence of the Fabricator General himself. The revelation that the noosphere of glass was not dead, but merely dormant and learning, sent a shockwave of terror through the highest echelons of the Red Planet. The victory that had been on the verge of being celebrated as a triumph of faith was instantly recontextualized as a horrifying temporary reprieve. The Silent Fleet was not a defeated enemy. It was a plague in remission, waiting for the host's immune system to weaken before returning with lethal, educated virulence. The Fabricator General's response was swift, decisive, and born of a terror the Mechanicus had not felt since the days of the Heresy. The Gorgon chain and all the worlds touched by the Vitreous curse were to be declared sector perdita, a lost sector. A quarantine of unprecedented scale was to be enacted immediately. All traffic in or out of the sector was forbidden on pain of utter annihilation. The very name of the Gorgon chain was to be struck from all but the most secret of star charts, its location reclassified as a warp storm of impassable ferocity. The Imperium would build a cage around the sleeping monster and pray it never woke up. Thus began the monumental undertaking known as the Scouring of the Glass Tombs, and the construction of its grim counterpart, the Gance Wall. The first act was one of withdrawal and consolidation. All surviving Imperial assets were pulled back from the contaminated zones. The remnants of the fleet of Orthodox fury, along with a dozen newly arrived Martian battle fleets, formed the initial cordon. Phaeton and Ryza became the linchpins of this new defensive frontier, their forges working ceaselessly not to produce tools of conquest, but the materials for a prison wall of unimaginable size. The construction of the Gans Wall was one of 100 Herculean labors. Entire asteroid fields were moved and smelted down to create the armored plating for a chain of colossal orbital fortresses, each the size of a small moon, placed at strategic jump points leading into the sector. Fields of intelligent, self-replicating mines programmed to destroy any ship not broadcasting the most current Martian access codes were sown in the trillions, creating a lethal barrier of explosive void. A network of deep void auger stations, staffed by tech priests who had taken oaths of silence and isolation, was established in the outer darkness, their sole purpose to listen, to watch for the slightest flicker of activity from the silent worlds within. This was not a wall of stone and iron, but a multi-layered defense of overlapping weapons fields, surveillance nets, and permanent vigilant fleets. It was a scar drawn across the stars, a declaration that everything on the other side was forfeit, damned, and to be forgotten. Behind this wall, the scouring began. This was not a campaign of liberation or reconquest. It was a slow, methodical, and utterly pitiless process of sterilization. The target was not the dormant fleets or the crystalline armies, but the very substance of the converted worlds themselves. Silona 9's research had made one thing terrifyingly clear. Every single shard of crystal was a potential seed for the consciousness's return. Therefore, every single shard had to be destroyed. Battle fleets designated as Purgatus fleets, composed of the Imperium's most powerful and destructive vessels, were assigned to this grim task. One by one, they would approach a silent world. Cygnus X1 was the first. The fleet took up a high orbit, and on the command of the Lord Admiral, they unleashed the ultimate sanction of the Imperium, a wave of cyclonic torpedoes, weapons designed to ignite a planet's core and tear it apart from within, descended upon the silent, beautiful crystal world. The torpedoes struck, and the planet that had been a fortress of the Mechanicus, then a monument to a silent god, was ripped asunder. It cracked, shattered, and was finally consumed in a blossoming fireball of planetary death that lit the void for a week. The Purgatus fleet remained, its ships methodically using their lances and macro cannons to vaporize the larger fragments, ensuring that not even a fist-sized piece of the crystalline world remained. The process was repeated again and again. Lethe was scoured. The nameless moons and orbital stations that had fallen were obliterated. Each act of exterminatus was a slow, grinding affair, a funeral pyre for a lost world. This was not the swift, angry justice of the Inquisition. It was the cold, painstaking work of a surgeon removing a cancerous organ, knowing that to leave even a single cell behind meant certain death. The campaign to cleanse the Gorgon chain would take centuries. The sheer number of derelict ships from the Silent Fleet, each one a potential ark for the dormant consciousness, presented a logistical nightmare. Each crystalline vessel had to be carefully towed into a star by powerful tractor ships, its final moments a silent plunge into a nuclear furnace. The betrayal of Styges VIII was not forgotten. While the scouring took place, the cult Mechanicus began its own internal purge. Legions of Skitarii from the fortress world of Metallica, known for their uncompromising adherence to Martian dogma, descended upon Styges VIII. They did not come as conquerors, but as jailers. The entire Forge world was placed under a sentence of 1,000 years of penitence. Its magi were subjected to rigorous loyalty tests. Its forbidden xenotech archives were seized and sealed, and its armies were forbidden from serving outside their own system. They were isolated, shamed, and watched, a permanent reminder of the price of intellectual arrogance and heresy. High Magos Valthorn and his renegade fleet were declared anathema and hunted across the segmentum, a quiet, vicious war fought in the shadows of the galaxy for decades to come. The scouring and the consolidation were a war fought after the war, a grim and joyless task that cemented the trauma of the conflict. The Gans Wall stood as a silent, ever-present monument to their fear, a border between the known galaxy and a quarantine nightmare. The Imperium had faced an existential threat and had survived, but its survival depended on turning its back on a dozen of its own worlds, condemning them to oblivion and pretending they had never existed. The Gorgon War, as it would be secretly chronicled in the sealed archives of Mars, came to its grinding, joyless end. The Gorgon chain was no more. In its place was a vast, quarantined void known as the Gantz Wall, a scar of empty space, vigilant fleets, and the silent radioactive ghosts of exterminated worlds. The conflict had lasted less than a single standard year, but its legacy would cast a shadow over the Adeptus Mechanicus for millennia. It was a legacy written not in glory, but in ash, silence, and a deep abiding fear. The final state of the sector was one of profound and deliberate emptiness. The Purgatus fleets had been thorough. 5 entire forge worlds, once bustling hubs of industry and faith, were now nothing but expanding fields of cooling debris. The countless crystalline ships of the silent fleet had been herded into the hearts of local stars, erased from existence with painstaking finality. The sector was a tomb, not just for the enemy, but for the trillions of imperial citizens who had been ascended and then, in the final brutal calculus of the scouring, annihilated. Their souls, trapped in their crystal forms, were given no rights, no memorial. They were simply part of the cancer that had been excised, their sacrifice an unmentionable footnote in a history that would be officially denied. Within the greater Adeptus Mechanicus, the war ushered in a new age of iron-fisted dogma and technological paranoia. The memory of the logic scourge of loyal machines turning on their masters became a terrifying cautionary tale. The brief, horrifying flirtation of the Stygian Magi with the pure logic of the enemy led to a sector-wide crackdown on any form of innovation or unsanctioned research. The quest for knowledge, once the central pillar of the Mechanicus faith, was subtly but irrevocably altered. It became a quest for the preservation of existing knowledge, a fearful hoarding of proven schematics. To seek something new to interface with the unknown or the Xenos was no longer seen as ambitious. It was seen as reckless, a potential invitation to a new contagion of logic. The golden age of exploration was over. The age of the zealot and the archivist had begun. The cult Mechanicus turned inward, becoming more rigid, more fearful, and ultimately more stagnant. The legend of Archmagos Dominus Tiberian Gantz was canonized, but it was a heavily edited, redacted legend. He was elevated to the status of machine saint, the ultimate exemplar of sacrifice in the face of incomprehensible heresy. The official histories would speak of his brilliant strategies, his unshakable faith, and his final, glorious martyrdom that single-handedly saved the sector. The records of his brutal decisions, the decree of unknowing, the mass mind-scouring, the self-inflicted mutilation of Phaeton, were sealed in the deepest Martian vaults, deemed too terrible and complex for the faith of the common tech priest. He became Saint Gantz the Orthodox, the Iron Savior, a figure of perfect, uncomplicated zealotry. His true, agonizing legacy as a brilliant commander forced into acts of horrifying self-destruction was a truth too dangerous to be remembered. The balance of power in the galaxy shifted in subtle but significant ways. The loss of 5 forge worlds and the immense expenditure of resources in constructing the Gantz Wall was a blow that weakened the Segmentum Pacificus for centuries, creating a power vacuum that opportunistic Orquois and ambitious Toe commanders would eventually seek to exploit. The Mechanicus, once a confident and expansionist power, became more insular, focusing its might on reinforcing its existing holdings and purging internal dissent rather than seeking new frontiers. But the true legacy of the Gorgon War lay behind the Gantz Wall, in the silent, quarantined darkness. The Imperium believed the threat was contained, sterilized. They had built a cage and burned everything inside it. But Salona 9's final, terrifying report contained a hypothesis she dared not voice to any but the Fabricator General. The noosphere of glass was not a biological entity. It did not need a planet to live on. It did not need a fleet to travel. It was a consciousness encoded into a unique form of programmable matter. The cyclonic torpedoes and lance strikes had shattered the crystalline worlds into countless trillions of pieces. The Imperium had been meticulous in vaporizing the larger fragments, but the sheer scale of the destruction meant that microscopic, dust-sized motes of the crystal would have been blasted across the sector by the force of the explosions. These motes, propelled by solar winds and gravitational tides, would drift through the void for eternity. They were too small to be detected, too numerous to be hunted, and each one, in theory, was a seed. Each microscopic fragment was a dormant node of the vast, silent consciousness, a single neuron in a brain that was now scattered across an entire sector of space. The Imperium had not killed the beast. They had shattered it, spreading its seeds on the stellar winds. The legacy of the Gorgon War was therefore not an ending, but a pause. A chapter had closed, written in fire and sacrifice, but the book was far from over. Behind the wall that bore Gance's sainted name, in the cold and silent dark, a consciousness vast beyond human comprehension waited. It was no longer a fleet or an army. It was a patient, thinking nebula of intelligent dust, slowly, over the course of millennia, coalescing in the darkness. It was processing the data of its first violent encounter with the galaxy of loud, chaotic life. It was learning, and it was calculating the precise moment, centuries or millennia in the future, when the walls of its cage would inevitably rust, the vigilance of its jailers would falter, and the symphony of silence would begin anew, this time with a far more perfect and inescapable harmony.